It was a chilly Monday morning at Jefferson High School, just outside Chicago. The hallway buzzed with locker doors slamming, sneakers squeaking against linoleum, and the low murmur of teens dreading first period. In room 208, the air was unusually quiet. Mrs. Ruth Cartwright, the creative writing teacher, stood at the front of the classroom with a tall stack of printed poems in her hand. Her glasses rested low on her nose, and her tone was sharp, controlled. "These," she said, waving the pages like a warning, "are the submissions for our spring poetry project. Some were decent, some need work, and one in particular I found interesting." She smirked slightly, as if about to tell a joke. In the third row, Malik Thompson, a quiet 17-year-old black student, sat up straighter. He wore a hoodie and had a pencil tucked behind his ear. His journal was always with him, dog-eared, messy, alive with words he never said out loud. He had spent hours on his poem, poured in things he'd never told his friends, or even his mother. It wasn't about rhyming or sounding clever. It was about memory, about the fire that burned down his grandmother's house, about the silence afterward, about rebuilding. Miss Cartwright read aloud from his poem, putting emphasis in all the wrong places. "Ashes in my lungs, smoke where breath should be, and still I walk, even if my name gets lost in the wind." She paused and raised an eyebrow. "I suppose that's dramatic," she said dryly. A few students chuckled, unsure if they were supposed to. "We don't need trauma to write good poetry. Sometimes less is more." Malik stared down at his desk. His face was unreadable, but his fists were clenched under the table. Miss Cartwright moved on, praising another student's light-hearted rhyming couplets about fast food. Malik didn't hear the rest. His poem had been laughed at, publicly dissected, reduced to too emotional. He had thought, just for a moment, that maybe his voice mattered, that maybe someone would see it for what it was, truth, not drama. But in that room, in front of that teacher, he felt invisible again. What he didn't know was that another teacher, one passing by outside in the hallway, had heard the poem through the open door. And he'd paused. He'd heard something real. And unlike Ms. Cartwright, he hadn't stopped listening. The bell rang, ending first period. But Malik didn't move. While the rest of the class filed out, chatting, tossing backpacks over shoulders, barely noticing the moment that had just passed, he sat frozen at his desk, eyes locked on the crumpled copy of his poem. Miss Cartwright hadn't returned it. She had tossed it on the edge of her desk like scrap paper. He reached over and picked it up. Ink smudged, edges torn, still whole. He stuffed it into his notebook and slung his backpack over one shoulder. As he stepped into the hallway, he nearly bumped into someone. "Whoa, hey there," said a voice. It was Mr. Alvarez, the 11th grade English teacher. His tie was always crooked, and he carried around a coffee mug that said, "Words matter." He smiled, but his eyes were serious. "You wrote that poem Miss Cartwright read, didn't you?" Malik blinked. "You heard that?" Hard not to. The door was open. He lowered his voice. "And I heard something in it. Something real. That line. Ashes in my lungs. Smoke where breath should be. That stayed with me." Malik shrugged. Didn't stay with her. Mr. Alvarez frowned. Not everyone knows what to do with pain when it's honest. Some teachers, they want neatness. Your poem wasn't neat. It was alive. Malik looked down, unsure of what to say. "Listen," Alvarez continued, pulling a folded flyer from his folder. "There's a national youth poetry competition. Submissions are due next month. It's sponsored by the National Literacy Foundation. I think you should enter." Malik hesitated. "After that? You serious?" Mr. Alvarez stepped closer. "You don't write for applause, Malik. You write for the truth. If that truth shakes people, let it. That just means they heard you." He handed Malik the flyer. Bright letters across the top read, "Speak Up, the National Youth Voices Literary Prize." First prize was $10,000. Publication. A trip to Washington, D.C. to read your piece live. Malik looked at the flyer, then at his torn-up poem. He almost said no, but something inside him, the part that had written those words in the first place, the part that didn't care if they were too emotional, whispered, "Do it." He tucked the flyer into his notebook and walked to his next class, not proud, not confident, not even certain, just ready. The bell rang, ending first period, but Malik didn't move. While the rest of the class filed out, chatting, tossing backpacks over shoulders, barely noticing the moment that had just passed, he sat frozen at his desk, eyes locked on the crumpled copy of his poem. Ms. Cartwright hadn't returned it. She had tossed it on the edge of her desk like scrap paper. He reached over and picked it up. Ink smudged, edges torn, still whole. He stuffed it into his notebook and slung his backpack over one shoulder. As he stepped into the hallway, he nearly bumped into someone. "Whoa, hey there," said a voice. It was Mr. Alvarez, the 11th grade English teacher. His tie was always crooked, and he carried around a coffee mug that said, "Words matter." He smiled, but his eyes were serious. "You wrote that poem Ms. Cartwright read, didn't you?" Malik blinked. "You heard that?" "Hard not to. The door was open." He lowered his voice, and I heard something in it. Something real. That line, "Ashes in my lungs, smoke where breath should be," that stayed with me. Malik shrugged. "Didn't stay with her." Mr. Alvarez frowned. "Not everyone knows what to do with pain when it's honest. Some teachers, they want neatness. Your poem wasn't neat. It was alive." Malik looked down, unsure of what to say. "Listen," Alvarez continued, pulling a folded flyer from his folder. "There's a National Youth Poetry Competition. Submissions are due next month. It's sponsored by the National Literacy Foundation. I think you should enter." Malik hesitated. "After that? You serious?" Mr. Alvarez stepped closer. "You don't write for applause, Malik. You write for the truth. If that truth shakes people, let it. That just means they heard you." He handed Malik the flyer. Bright letters across the top read, "Speak Up. The National Youth Voices Literary Prize first prize was $10,000. Publication. A trip to Washington, D.C. to read your piece live." Malik looked at the flyer, then at his torn-up poem. He almost said no. But something inside him, the part that had written those words in the first place, the part that didn't care if they were too emotional, whispered, "Do it." He tucked the flyer into his notebook and walked to his next class, not proud, not confident, not even certain, just ready. A week after Malik submitted his poem, word started to spread. Mr. Alvarez, proud and unable to help himself, mentioned at a faculty meeting that one of his students had entered the National Youth Voices Literary Prize. He didn't name names, but Jefferson High wasn't big, and gossip moved faster than fact. By lunch, Ms. Cartwright knew. She leaned back in her chair in the English department lounge, sipping from her mug and muttering under her breath, "Of course he'd go behind my back." It wasn't just that Malik had entered the contest, it was that he'd done it without her approval, without her recommendation, her edits, her blessing. In her mind, that was defiance, insubordination. A student like Malik should be grateful just to be in AP writing. She pulled up the contest website and scanned the rules. 1 entry per student. Must be original work. Finalists to be announced April 10th. Her fingers hovered over her keyboard. Then she opened the school's administrative portal. She didn't have access to Malik's personal file, not directly. But she could see his academic record, his essays, his writing portfolio. She searched through his past poems and stories, looking for anything that might match what he'd submitted. If she could prove that he'd reused material, or that someone else had helped him, even if it was just enough to raise suspicion, she could report it. She composed a carefully worded email to the contest committee. "Dear editors, as a creative writing teacher, I support student expression, but I have concerns about the originality of a recent submission from one of our students. I can't confirm plagiarism, but the tone and maturity seem inconsistent with the student's past work. I simply urge you to review it carefully." She didn't sign it with her full name, just "a concerned educator." And then she sent it. To her, it was protecting standards. To Malik, had he known, it would have felt like betrayal all over again. But she had underestimated something. The poem was real. The voice was real. The truth was real, and real things once spoken are hard to erase. It was a rainy Tuesday when the announcement came. Malik had just sat down in the cafeteria, earbuds in, tray untouched. He was halfway through a new poem in his notebook when his phone buzzed. A single notification lit up the screen. Congratulations! You've been selected as a national finalist in the Youth Voices Literary Prize. He stared at it. For a moment, the world around him went quiet. Finalist. His name. His poem. He read the email 3 more times to be sure. The message was real. They even invited him to record a video reading of his poem, which would be broadcast at the finalist showcase in Washington, D.C. He looked up, stunned. And the first person he saw across the lunchroom was Mr. Alvarez. Their eyes met. Mr. Alvarez raised his eyebrows, then saw Malik's grin. He grinned too. Later that afternoon, the news made its way through the school. Teachers began whispering. Students posted screenshots of the contest website, where Malik's name appeared on the official finalist list. That same day, Ms. Cartwright received an email of her own. From the contest committee. Dear educator, we appreciate your concern, but our panel has confirmed that the work submitted by Malik Thompson is entirely original. The voice, tone, and content reflect a deeply authentic and individual perspective, which is why it stood out among thousands of entries. Thank you for supporting young writers. No reprimand, no accusation, just quiet dismissal. She closed her laptop and said nothing. But the hallway chatter didn't let her ignore it. Malik's name was on everyone's lips, not as a troubled student or overly dramatic writer, but as a writer worth reading. Later that week, the principal asked Malik to read his poem at the next school assembly. He agreed, cautiously. He wasn't seeking revenge or vindication. He just wanted to be heard on his terms. When the day came, he stood on stage in the same gym where he'd sat in silence so many times. His voice shook at first, but then it steadied. His words rang out across the bleachers, across the echoing space, across every student who had ever been overlooked or underestimated. Even Ms. Cartwright sat in the crowd, her hands folded, her expression unreadable. And when Malik finished, there was a pause, then a roar of applause. For the first time, his truth wasn't met with silence. It was met with a standing ovation. The flight to Washington, D.C. was Malik's first time on a plane. He sat by the window, watching the clouds drift by, his journal balanced on his lap. He wasn't writing, not yet. Just thinking. About where he'd come from. About where he was going. About how words, once locked away in private pages, had carried him all the way here. When he arrived at the Youth Voices Literary Summit, he was stunned by the size of it. There were students from all over the country, from rural towns, inner cities, reservations, and suburbs. Different accents, different stories, but the same fire behind their eyes. The showcase was held in a large theater near Capitol Hill. The audience included educators, authors, activists, and even members of Congress. Cameras lined the back wall, bright lights overhead. Malik sat backstage, knees bouncing. Malik Thompson? A woman in a headset called. He stood. You're on in 5. He took a deep breath, then another. When his name was announced, the applause was polite, curious. The crowd didn't know who he was yet, but they would. He stepped to the microphone and looked out across the audience. The lights were hot, his throat dry. He began to speak. At first, the words were careful, controlled. But then something unlocked, like wind through an open window. The emotion poured out. His poem about loss, about fire, about rebuilding, it cracked the air like thunder. No theatrics, just truth. When he finished, the silence was full. Not of awkwardness, but of awe. Then came the applause. Long, loud, rising. Afterward, dozens of people came to shake his hand. A senator told him his words reminded her of Baldwin. A woman in her 60s wept and said his poem reminded her of losing her own childhood home. A girl in a hijab handed him a note that said, I feel less alone because of you. That night, Malik lay in his hotel bed staring at the ceiling, the city lights flickering through the window. He didn't win first prize. That went to a girl from New Mexico whose poem about her brother's deportation left everyone in tears. But it didn't matter, because for the first time, Malik didn't need a trophy to feel seen. His voice had made it past the walls of his classroom, past the limits others had tried to place on him. It had become a bridge, and people were crossing it. The Monday after Malik returned from Washington, the school looked the same. Same hallways, same buzzing fluorescent lights, same lockers dented from years of use. But to Malik, something had shifted. It wasn't the building that had changed. It was him. People nodded to him in the hallway now. Classmates he'd never spoken to. A few teachers asked to read his work. Someone had printed out a copy of his finalist certificate and taped it to the wall near the main office, right under a banner that read, "Jefferson High believes in student voices." That day, Mr. Alvarez gave him a new journal, leather-bound, clean pages, a ribbon marker. On the inside cover, he had written, "Keep writing like the world is listening, because now it is." Malik smiled and slid it into his backpack. At the end of the day, as he was walking past room 208, he noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar, though the classroom was empty. He almost walked past, but then he saw her. Miss Cartwright sitting at her desk, alone, papers in front of her. No sharp tone, no sarcasm, just still. As he paused, she looked up. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither said anything. Then she spoke. "Malik," she said quietly, "I read your poem." He nodded once. "Yeah, a lot of people have now." She looked down. Her voice was smaller than he'd ever heard it. "It was good. Powerful." A beat passed. He waited, unsure what he expected. She didn't apologize, not exactly, but her eyes did. And maybe that was enough. He gave her a single, steady look. Not angry, not smug. Just calm. "Thanks," he said. "I didn't write it for your approval." And then he walked away. No grand moment, no slow clap. Just footsteps echoing down a hallway where he had once been silenced, now walking in full voice. That night, he sat at his desk with the new journal open. He didn't write about her. He didn't need to. Instead, he wrote the first line of a new poem. "My name isn't small enough to fit in your margins anymore." And he kept writing, because now the world wasn't just listening, it was waiting.